Mississippi, 1851. The air hung heavy, as though the earth itself had forgotten how to breathe. Dawn rose pale over the Hargrove plantation, turning the cotton rows into ribbons of silver mist. The fields were wide as the horizon, yet strangely still. Not even a crow dared to cry. The narrator speaks of a land that remembers. Every furrow holds echoes of footsteps long faded, and the wind carries 1,000 unspoken prayers. The locals call this place the Field of Ghosts, a name whispered in the tavern and at the river docks, where men claim to have seen a light wandering through the rows at night. At the center of these whispers stands one figure, Caleb, a man unlike any other in the county. His skin is pale as morning milk, his eyes the gray of storm clouds. The people say he was born touched by moonlight, neither cursed nor blessed but set apart. He moves quietly through the fields, shoulders bent beneath the weight of a world that seldom welcomes difference. When he walks among the cotton, his outline shimmers in the haze, and the other workers glance away, crossing themselves. Children hide behind barrels when he passes. To them, he is a ghost already living on borrowed air. Only the sound of the wind acknowledges him, brushing through the dry stalks like a sigh. From the big house on the hill, Nathaniel Hargrove watches. To him, the land is proof of his own dominion. Every row planted, every hand counted. Yet even he cannot explain the silence that clings to the mornings, or the faint tremor that passes through the soil when Caleb walks by. He calls it nonsense, superstition, but his voice tightens each time he says it. The overseer, a man fond of whiskey and cruel jokes, tells travelers that the pale field hand draws storms behind him. When he's near, the air spoils, he says, and the cotton blushes pink before the rain. None laugh for long. The sky darkens as if to answer. Nights on the plantation come slow, soaked in the hum of cicadas and the steady beat of distant thunder. Lanterns sway on porches, their light swallowed by humidity. Sometimes, out by the edge of the property, a single flame is seen drifting among the stalks. It moves against the wind, pausing, turning, then vanishing as though drawn underground. Folks say it's him, Caleb, walking even in his sleep, called by something the living cannot hear. Inside the small workers' quarters, whispered stories pass from lip to lip. They speak of a mark that follows him, of dreams in which he stands beneath the hanging moon, whispering in a language older than the Delta. They say the earth listens when he speaks. Some are afraid, some are simply waiting to see what the earth will do next. In the parlor of the house, Eleanor Hargrove listens to the wind as she sews by lamplight. She's heard the stories too, though her husband forbids such talk. Something about that pale, quiet man unsettles her, not from fear, but from a sadness she cannot name. When she glances from the window, she thinks she sees him standing by the well, head bowed, the moonlight silvering his hair. A blink later, he is gone. Days stretch into weeks. The cotton ripens thick and white, bending the plants with its weight. Yet the soil seems restless, breathing underfoot. A faint rust-colored dust sometimes stains the lower leaves. No one can explain it. The workers whisper of omens, and even the foreman keeps glancing over his shoulder. One dusk, as twilight bleeds across the fields, Caleb pauses mid-row. The sky is bruised purple, the air trembling with faraway thunder. He raises his gaze toward the horizon, and for a heartbeat, everything stills. No wind, no sound. Then a whisper threads through the cotton, not from any throat, but from the land itself. A sigh that seems to say his name. Later that night, the household dog howls without reason. Windows shiver though the air is still. In the darkness, a candle on the porch gutted out, leaving a thin curl of smoke drifting like a question. Somewhere between the rows, a soft footprint appears in the dust. No weight, only shape, as if the ground remembers someone who has not yet gone. The next morning dawns crimson, the sun climbing through a haze the color of diluted blood. Nathaniel stands on his balcony and squints at the field. For the first time he feels the faint sting of unease. The cotton gleams unnaturally bright, dew glinting like 1,000 watchful eyes. He shakes it off, muttering about storms and superstition, and turns away. Down below, Caleb lifts his head. The wind combs through the rows, carrying with it a low hum, a promise or a warning. In that sound hides the heartbeat of the story to come, a pulse older than the plantation, older than sin itself. And so the field waits, the land has memory, and the ghosts are only sleeping. The heat came first, not the summer heat that ripens fruit, but the kind that crushes breath and thought alike. It lay across the land like a sentence, pressing the fields flat beneath its weight. The Hargrove plantation drifted through those days in a half-sleep, the people moving as if underwater. Even the crickets had fallen silent. When the air stands still that long, old voices start to wander. Some said the ground was sulking, others said it was listening. Caleb worked without word or complaint. The light on his skin turned him nearly invisible against the glare. To the onlookers he was little more than a shimmer, a figure made of heat and distance. Yet wherever he passed, the cotton seemed to stiffen, the leaves folding inward as if afraid of touch. By mid-July, stories began to twist through the quarters like vines. One woman swore she'd dreamed of Caleb standing beside her bed, eyes wide open, whispering a string of sounds too old to name. In the morning she found a faint trace of white dust on her windowsill, the same powder that clings to ripe cotton. Another man claimed that when Caleb looked his way, the wind dropped dead for a full minute. They started calling it the hush. Inside the big house, Nathaniel pretended to ignore the talk, though his hand now trembled each time he reached for his glass. He told himself it was the heat, the endless work, the way the clouds stacked black on the horizon and refused to break. Yet in the quiet between heartbeats, he could almost feel a pulse rising from the ground, answering his own. Eleanor watched her husband fade into restlessness. She heard him mutter Caleb's name in his sleep, the way one might speak of a debt that could never be paid. She said nothing. Silence had long been her only safe language. But when she walked past the back veranda at dusk, she sometimes glimpsed Caleb kneeling near the well, hands clasped, murmuring into the earth. The sound wasn't prayer or song, it was closer to a heartbeat slowed to speech. The sky broke at last on a Sunday. Lightning forked the clouds and rain came down like nails. The field flooded, turning the soil into black mirrors that reflected the heavens. The next morning the storm was gone, but its smell lingered, metal, ozone, and something sweet, like sap or blood. When the workers stepped out, they found the cotton glistening, each boll tinted faintly pink as though the rain had stained it. The overseer cursed, saying the crop was ruined, but by afternoon the color had drained away, leaving the plants snow-white again, their edges quivering in a wind no one could feel. Nathaniel blamed mildew, blamed weather, blamed everything but what his mind whispered. Still that night he sent men to cut a new ditch, hoping to drain the fields, as if he could drain fear itself. Their spades struck something hard beneath the mud. Not stone, not wood, but a smooth shape that gave off a dull glow before vanishing under a fresh surge of water. One man dropped his shovel and ran. The following day, Nathaniel noticed strange markings near the barn. Spirals of ash arranged like writing, the center of each marked by a single white feather. He ordered them erased, but when the servants returned with brooms, the symbols had already scattered on their own, as though swept by an unseen hand. That evening, the air shimmered again. A low hum rose from the fields, so soft that at first it seemed like a trick of the ears. Then the hum deepened into rhythm, the slow cadence of a drum that wasn't there. It pulsed through the floorboards, through the walls, through the hearts of everyone who could hear. Dogs whimpered, horses kicked at their stalls. Nathaniel stood at the window, pale and sweating, whispering that it was thunder still trapped beneath the clouds. In her room upstairs, Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest and felt the same beat echoing inside her. She thought of Caleb's stillness, his strange calm, the way he seemed to carry weather within him. For the first time she wondered if the earth itself had chosen him to remember something the rest of them had tried too long to forget. The next morning dawned sharp and blue. The air smelled clean, almost new. People tried to shake off the memory of the humming night. Yet all through the day, small things went wrong. Tools broke, ropes frayed, the milk soured before evening, and every time someone glanced toward the far end of the field, they swore they saw a pale figure standing where the ground dipped toward the bayou, staring back through the shimmer of heat. By week's end, Nathaniel called for a preacher from town to bless the property. The man arrived dusty and skeptical, carrying a Bible heavy enough to anchor him against superstition. But when he opened it on the porch, a gust rose from nowhere and flipped the pages wild. He shut the book, eyes wide, and said perhaps prayer was best offered from a distance. That night, as the sun fell, the plantation exhaled. Crickets returned. The oppressive weight in the air seemed to lift, but only a little. Deep in the fields, a faint light moved between the rows, neither lantern nor flame. It glided to the edge of the property and stopped at the very place where the stormwater had unearthed that glowing shape. Then quietly the light folded into the earth and disappeared. When dawn came, the cotton leaves glittered again, wet with dew that smelled faintly of iron. No one spoke of it aloud, but the name Caleb hung in every throat. The hush had returned, thick as fog. The curse, if there was one, had no words and no witnesses. It lived only in the silence, and in the way the land now seemed to breathe on its own. The house stood at the edge of the world, or so it felt to Caleb. Beyond the cotton fields where ghosts breathed through the stalks, the master's mansion rose like a bleached skeleton against the dusk. Columns tall and proud but hollow, windows glimmering with candlelight that trembled like frightened eyes. Inside, the air was thick with secrets, secrets soaked into the wallpaper, into the rugs, into the silence that fell when the master's boots crossed the floorboards. That evening, a storm gathered over the delta. The sky rolled low and swollen, carrying the smell of iron and rain. Caleb lingered near the back steps, his albino skin almost luminescent in the twilight. His presence unsettled the others, not for his color but for what they could not name. Some said the devil had marked him pale so the Lord would see his sins more clearly. Others whispered that Caleb had no soul to stain at all. Inside, the master, Edward Claymore, paced the parlor. A decanter of bourbon gleamed amber in the lamplight. He poured himself a glass with trembling hands, staring at his reflection in the darkened window pane. The reflection wavered, as though the glass itself recoiled from him. Outside, lightning flickered, and for the briefest instant it wasn't his face staring back, but Caleb's, pale and watchful. Claymore cursed under his breath and turned away. His conscience had become a living thing, breathing, muttering, scratching at the edges of his mind. He remembered that morning, how Caleb had turned his strange pink eyes toward him when the sun hit the fields. There had been no fear in those eyes, only calm, a kind of judgment. It unnerved him more than a scream ever could. He poured another drink. The thunder cracked like a whip. Boys cursed, he muttered, as if saying it out loud could make it truth instead of guilt. He ain't natural. He ain't right. But deep inside he knew better. It wasn't Caleb who was cursed. It was him. That night he dreamed of the fields running red, not with blood, but with rain tinted by the clay earth. He saw himself wading through it, waist-deep, as something pale moved through the storm. A shape, a whisper, a voice he couldn't place. "You can't own what don't belong to the living," it said. When he awoke, his sheets were damp with sweat, and the bourbon bottle lay shattered beside the bed. Caleb, meanwhile, felt something shifting in the world. The storm had loosened more than the soil. It had disturbed the boundaries between what was seen and what was buried. He felt it in his bones, a humming low and constant. The whispers that once came from the wind now came from the ground. The earth remembered every sin committed upon it, and it was restless. When morning came, the sky hung grey as lead. Claymore stood on the porch, his face pale and drawn. He saw Caleb across the field, standing motionless among the cotton rows, his white skin glowing faintly through the mist. For a moment the master thought he saw something else behind him, a shimmer, a shadow that pulsed and then vanished. He blinked and it was gone, but the dread lingered. By noon the overseer came running, hat clutched tight, eyes wild. "Sir, the boy," he stammered. "He talks to things in the dirt. Says he hears voices." Claymore's lips curled. Voices or conscience? The overseer didn't answer. That evening, the master went out to the field himself. He found Caleb kneeling, hands sunk in the soil, lips moving in prayer or spell. When Claymore called his name, the boy didn't move. The master stepped closer and saw tears running down Caleb's face, pale as glass. "I didn't choose this," Caleb whispered, "but the ground did. The ground remembers." The master felt the words strike something deep inside him, a memory he'd buried with all the others. He had once believed the land belonged to him, but now it felt as though the land was reclaiming itself piece by piece through the ghostly vessel before him. "Stop this," he hissed. "You'll bring ruin." Caleb looked up then, and the look in his eyes made Claymore stumble back. They weren't the eyes of a man, but of something older, something that had seen everything and forgiven nothing. The air shifted. The storm began again, soft at first, then raging. Cotton stalks bent and whispered like voices of the dead. The wind wrapped around Caleb, stirring the dust into spirals that danced at his feet. And as lightning ripped the horizon in two, the master saw it, just for an instant, a faint outline of other faces flickering behind Caleb, dozens of them, hollow-eyed, silent, luminous. He fled to the house, clutching the railing like a drowning man. But even there, he couldn't shut out the whispers. They were inside now, in the walls, in his heartbeat, in every drop of bourbon he drank to forget. For the first time, Edward Claymore realized that his sin did not live in the past. It was alive, and it had found its voice. Morning came red. Not the gentle pink of dawn, but the deep, bruised red of something wounded. The Mississippi sky bled across the horizon, and the cotton fields glowed like rows of ghostly hands reaching up from the earth. The storm had passed, yet everything still trembled. The ground, the air, even the crows that perched silent upon the fence posts, as though afraid to speak. Caleb stood barefoot in the field, where the soil still wept with rain. His pale skin caught the first light of day, and for a moment he looked less like a man than a reflection, as if the sun itself had turned him into something not quite real. Around him the cotton swayed in rhythm, though no wind touched it. Each stalk seemed alive, whispering secrets that only he could hear. The others watched from a distance. No one dared to approach. They had begun to call him by a new name, the Phantom of the Field. Some swore that during the storm they'd seen lights flicker around him, small and white like fireflies rising from graves. Others whispered that when Caleb spoke, the rain had stopped, obeying his voice as if it were command, not prayer. The overseer spat into the mud. "Ain't right," he muttered. "Ain't natural." But even he did not move closer. From the porch, Edward Claymore stared across the expanse of cotton, his jaw clenched. His eyes were rimmed red from sleeplessness, haunted by the image of Caleb's face, that pale judgment staring through the lightning. The master had always believed the land belonged to him, but now, looking at the boy standing motionless in the rising sun, he felt the first crack in that certainty. For the first time, the land looked back. Caleb turned his gaze toward the house, as though he had felt the master's stare pierce the air between them. Their eyes met, two men bound by a chain of guilt and something older than blood. And in that silent moment the sky shifted again, deepening from crimson to rust, as though the heavens themselves blushed with shame. The master called for his horse. He could not sit idle any longer, he told himself. He had to see what had taken root in his own fields. He rode out toward the boy, boots striking mud, heart pounding with the rhythm of hooves. The closer he came, the colder the air grew, until his breath began to frost, though it was midsummer. Caleb did not move. His hands were pressed to the soil as though listening to its pulse. The cotton around him had taken on a strange hue. White turned faintly pink, like cloth soaked in diluted blood. "What are you doing?" The master barked, but his voice sounded smaller than he meant it to. Caleb raised his head slowly. His eyes shimmered faintly under the bleeding light. "The land's crying," he said softly. "You can't stop it. You can't unmake what you've sown." The master's grip on the reins tightened. "You'll stop this madness, or I'll—" But the threat died on his tongue, for at that moment a deep rumble tore through the earth beneath them. Not thunder, not this time. It came from below, from the very bones of the plantation. The horse reared in terror, nearly throwing its rider. And in that shuddering instant, Caleb's eyes rolled white, and his voice changed, deeper, layered, as though 100 others spoke through him. "They sleep no more," it said. "They've waited in the roots and rivers, and now the blood remembers." Lightning cracked again, but there were no clouds. The sky flashed red, and for an instant, every stalk of cotton seemed to tremble with life. Claymore's vision blurred. He saw faces in the mist, familiar, half-forgotten, sunken eyes and open mouths that moved in silence. The air filled with a low humming, a sound like the earth mourning its own history. He stumbled from his horse, sinking to his knees in the wet soil. "Stop!" he cried, half in rage, half in terror. "Stop, you hear me?" Caleb's voice softened. "You can't stop a prayer once it's been answered." And with that, the wind rose. It came from every direction, hot, dry, and filled with whispers. Dust spiraled around them, carrying the scent of rain and iron. The sky deepened from red to black, as if night had fallen again in the middle of day. The fields moaned under the weight of it. The overseers fled, shouting to one another, their voices lost in the roar. But Caleb stood still, hands lifted to the air. The storm that had begun within the earth now bloomed across the heavens. Every gust carried something unseen, fragments of memory, pain, and truth that could no longer be buried. From the mansion windows, servants watched crosses of lightning split the fields. They said the clouds bled light that day, that the rain fell red, and that each drop that touched the soil hissed like it had struck flesh. By dusk, the storm had gone. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. The cotton fields lay flattened and dark, their flowers wilted like extinguished candles. In the center of it all stood Caleb, drenched in mud, his pale eyes turned toward the sinking sun. The master approached cautiously, trembling. "What have you done?" Caleb didn't answer. He looked up at the sky, which still glowed faintly red, and whispered almost tenderly, "It's not me who did it. The land just remembered how to bleed." And in that instant, Claymore understood what haunted him. The ghosts weren't rising from graves. They were seeping from the ground itself, from every lash, every cry, every drop of sweat that had ever touched the Mississippi clay. The sky had only mirrored what lay beneath it. The days that followed were a strange kind of quiet. Not peace, but the hush that comes after a wound. The storm had left the land trembling. Trees leaned as if exhausted. The fields, once white with cotton, now lay bruised under a sickly red haze. Nothing moved except the river, the White River they called it. It cut through the plantation like a vein, wide, slow, and heavy with secrets. For years it had been the master's pride, feeding his fields, his fortune, his name. But now the river had changed. Its surface shimmered pale under the sun, like it was made of milk or bone. The workers whispered that the water was no longer water at all, but spirit-made liquid. At night it glowed faintly, a cold, silver light drifting between the reeds. Caleb stood on its bank at dawn, bare feet in the mud, eyes fixed on the surface. The current carried cotton blossoms downstream, but some of them were tinted pink, as if the river itself had begun to bleed. He knelt, cupped his hands, and let the strange water pass through his fingers. It was cool, but it hummed softly, like breath on glass. He whispered something into it, a prayer or maybe a warning, and the river rippled as if it had heard him. From the veranda, Nathaniel Claymore watched. His eyes were hollow, sleepless, ringed with the faint color of madness. He hadn't eaten in days. The storm had broken something inside him, something that all his cruelty had once kept whole. His wife Eleanor begged him to rest. He ignored her. The land was changing, and so was he. That evening he went to the preacher. Reverend Josiah Pike was an old man who believed in demons more than salvation. He came to the plantation with his Bible pressed to his chest and a pistol tucked beneath his coat. The master led him to the river, where the moonlight painted everything white. Pike stared at the glowing current, then crossed himself. "That ain't God's work," he whispered. "That's the earth remembering sin." "I want it gone," Claymore said. His voice cracked like dry wood. I want this curse torn out by its roots." The preacher opened his Bible, but the pages fluttered shut, as though caught by a wind that wasn't there. He swallowed hard. "You can't pray away what's earned. Blood don't forget, sir, not here. Not ever." Claymore's hands shook. "Then what am I to do?" Pike's eyes drifted toward the cotton fields in the distance, where the stalks swayed though no breeze touched them. "You stop feeding it," he said. "You stop letting it breathe." That night, Claymore ordered the river dammed. He brought men with shovels and lanterns, and they worked in silence, piling earth into its mouth. But the river fought back. The ground was soft, the current relentless. Each mound of dirt sank as if swallowed whole. By dawn the dam was gone, not washed away but vanished. Only the sound of rushing water remained, louder now, angrier. The men refused to return. One swore he saw faces in the river that night, pale and shifting beneath the surface, whispering in Caleb's voice. "You took from the living," they said. "Now the water takes from you." By morning the plantation's wells turned milky white. The livestock wouldn't drink. The crops began to rot from their roots upward. And still, the river gleamed like bone under the rising sun. Eleanor Claymore watched from her window, her heart caught between dread and sorrow. She saw Caleb walking along the far bank, head bowed, his shadow stretching long behind him. There was something peaceful about him, as if he carried no hatred, only inevitability. That night, unable to sleep, she crept from her bed and followed the sound of the river's whisper. It called to her, soft and rhythmic like a lullaby sung through water. She found herself at the bank, where mist coiled around her ankles and moonlight painted the surface like glass. She thought she saw movement, a figure beneath the water, pale and still, staring up at her. Caleb's eyes, but when she blinked he was gone. Behind her, Nathaniel's voice tore through the dark. "Eleanor, what are you doing out here?" She turned. His face looked hollow, almost skeletal in the lantern's light. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back from the edge. "You stay away from that water," he hissed. "It's not yours to touch." She stared at him. Neither was he. For a heartbeat they stood frozen, the river murmuring between them, carrying their words away. That night the water rose, quietly, steadily, until it spilled over its banks and crawled through the fields. By dawn the cotton rows shimmered white again, but with a faint red sheen under the light. The slaves awoke to find the land covered in dew that smelled faintly of iron. From the distance the overseer shouted. The river had overflowed the graves. The earth had given up what it once held tight. Nathaniel rode out at once. He found the ground soft and sunken, headstones tilting, names half swallowed by mud. The river had taken a new course, winding through the burial ground, whispering as it passed. When he looked down, he thought he saw something move, a hand pale as ash, rising briefly from the water before sinking again. He spurred his horse hard, fleeing toward the house. That evening, as darkness fell, the sound of the river reached every room. It was louder now, closer, as though it had crept up to the doorstep. Eleanor lay awake, listening to it, and thought she heard words in its rhythm. It begins where it ends. All white turns red. In the field, Caleb stood once more by the current, the moon behind him, his reflection rippling beneath his feet. The land was no longer his prison. It was his voice. The house began to breathe. At first it was subtle, the faint creak of wood, the shifting sigh of walls settling after rain. But as the nights deepened, the sound grew rhythmic, alive, as if the mansion itself had lungs. Every window pane seemed to pulse with the slow inhale of the earth, and every floorboard groaned with the memory of footsteps that no longer belonged to the living. Eleanor Claymore was the first to hear it clearly. It came at twilight, when the wind lay still and the river murmured in its sleep. She sat by her mirror, brushing her hair, when the sound rose through the floor. A low hum, almost like a hymn sung through closed lips. She froze. The brush slipped from her hand, and in the glass before her, her reflection wavered, not distorted, but doubled. Behind her stood another version of herself, pale, sorrowful, her dress soaked in white dust. The figure reached a hand toward her, and the mirror fogged over, erasing the space between them. When she turned around, the room was empty. Downstairs, Nathaniel Claymore sat alone by the fire. The flames flickered weakly, as though frightened of their own light. He hadn't spoken to Eleanor in days. His face had thinned, his eyes hollowed out by guilt and sleeplessness. The sound of the river outside gnawed at his thoughts. It was no longer distant. It was everywhere, whispering in the rafters, trickling behind the walls, echoing in his veins. He poured himself another drink. The amber liquid trembled in the glass. "Stop that," he muttered to no one. "Stop whispering." But the whisper only grew louder. He pressed his hands to his ears, yet the voice was inside now, calm, measured, patient. It spoke not in anger, but in remembrance. "You built this house on bones. You fed it with blood. Now it breathes because you made it live." He stumbled to his feet, knocking over the glass. The sound shattered through the room, and for an instant, the walls seemed to echo it back, like laughter. That night, Eleanor found crimson stains on the walls of the upstairs hallway. They appeared like veins, winding down from the ceiling, as though the house itself had begun to bleed. She touched one with trembling fingers. It was not paint, not rust, and when she drew her hand away, her fingertips glistened red. "Nathaniel," she whispered. But he did not answer. He was in the cellar, digging through boxes of ledgers and deeds, desperate to find something he could burn, something that might undo what had been done. But every page he opened was damp. The ink had run, smudging names and numbers into ghostly smears. And on the last page of his father's ledger, where the accounts of the old slave sales were listed, the ink bled until it formed one word: Caleb. Nathaniel stumbled back, his heart pounding. "No," he rasped. "You're gone. You're buried. You can't." The cellar door creaked shut above him. Darkness folded in. The whisper came again, soft, almost tender. "You buried the body, but not the truth." He shouted for Eleanor. No answer. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of river water and smoke. He struck a match. For a moment the light flickered across the stone walls, and he saw it. Handprints, pale and wet, covering every surface. He fell to his knees, clutching his head. "What do you want from me?" "To remember," the whisper said. Upstairs, Eleanor roamed the corridors, lantern in hand. The light glowed weakly against the wallpaper, where faces seemed to emerge in the patterns. Fleeting, sorrowful, watching her. Every mirror she passed turned to mist. Every door she opened led not to a room, but to a memory. In one doorway she saw a flash. The dining room as it had been years ago, filled with laughter, music, the clink of silver. But the figures around the table were faceless, their clothes soaked dark at the sleeves. At the head sat Nathaniel, eyes hollow, raising a cup that overflowed with something thicker than wine. She screamed. The vision vanished. The room stood empty again. When she found Nathaniel at last, he was sitting at the bottom of the cellar stairs, covered in dust and streaks of red. His eyes were wide and vacant. "She's here," he murmured. "She's in the walls. She walks through them like they're air." Eleanor knelt beside him. "Who?" He turned toward her slowly. "Caleb." The name hung in the air, and the house seemed to exhale. The lantern flickered, and a faint sound rose through the boards, the echo of footsteps moving across the upper floor. Eleanor's heart pounded. "There's no one there." But then the footsteps stopped above them, and from the ceiling a single drop fell, landing between them, dark red in the lantern light. They both looked up. The boards above were bleeding. The whisper returned, no longer just in their heads, but all around them, carried through the walls like wind. "The land remembers. The house remembers. Now you must too." Eleanor stood, trembling. "Nathaniel, we have to leave this place." He stared at her, eyes unfocused. "There's nowhere to go. The river's already here." Outside, the night was thick and humming. Mist rolled from the fields, seeping up the hill, wrapping the mansion in its cold embrace. The windows glowed faintly white, like eyes opening one by one. Inside, the air grew colder. Every portrait's face seemed to shift, eyes following, lips whispering the same word again and again, "Remember." Eleanor clutched her chest, breath quickening. Somewhere deep within the house, a door opened on its own, and the faint sound of running water drifted through the hall. She followed it, drawn by something she couldn't name. It led her to the old washroom, the one sealed years ago after a servant drowned in its basin. The door creaked open. The basin was full again, though no one had filled it. The water shimmered milky white under the lantern's glow. She leaned closer. Beneath the surface, a reflection looked back, not her own, but Caleb's, eyes calm, voice silent. And yet she heard him clearly. "It's not vengeance," he said. "It's remembrance." The lantern flickered once, then went out. The air thickened before the first drop fell. A low hum trembled through the night, the kind of sound that makes even the crickets fall silent. The mansion stood like a lone ghost upon the hill, its shutters drawn, its windows dim, its heartbeat matching the river below. The world held its breath. Then it began to rain, but this was no ordinary storm. The droplets were slow, heavy and tinted faintly crimson. Not blood, not water, but something in between. The people who saw it later would call it the night the heavens remembered. The drops fell upon the cotton fields like tears, soaking the white blossoms until they turned pale pink. The air smelled faintly of iron and roses. Sorrow and forgiveness mingled together. Inside the mansion, the sound of rain became a hymn. Each drop struck the roof with a rhythm that echoed through the halls, not random, but deliberate, like the slow beating of a drum in a funeral march. Eleanor stood at the window, her nightdress clinging to her arms, her face ghostly in the lightning's glow. She watched as the river swelled under the rain, rising higher, curling toward the house like a living thing reclaiming what had once been stolen. The reflection of the storm shimmered across the water, a mirror of the sky, burning red with memory. Behind her, Nathaniel Claymore sat hunched in a chair, half drunk, half broken. His eyes darted between the fire and the shadows that danced along the walls. He could hear them now, the whispers that had once been only in his mind. They filled the house, murmuring his name in voices that were neither angry nor kind, simply truthful. "You can't hide from the water," they said. "It finds every crack." Nathaniel rose unsteadily, the glass falling from his hand and shattering on the floor. "Show yourself," he cried into the dark. "If you're a ghost, then stand before me." The storm answered. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and for a moment the reflection in the mirror shifted. His own face, but pale as chalk, eyes hollow, mouth moving in silence. Then the light died, and he was alone again. Eleanor turned toward him, her voice trembling. "It's not you he's after, Nathaniel. It's the truth. The land won't rest until it's spoken aloud." He stared at her, lips trembling. "What truth? You think this is my doing?" "The fields remember," she said softly. "The house remembers. And so does your heart, even if your tongue refuses to." Outside, the thunder rolled like a voice clearing its throat. The front door creaked open, though no hand touched it. The wind swept in, carrying the scent of wet earth and something older, the smell of time itself coming undone. Eleanor gasped. Through the doorway, across the threshold of rain, a figure stood. It was not flesh, not shadow, but light, shaped like a man. The same faint whiteness as the river, soft and cold, haloed by the falling red rain. Caleb. Nathaniel stumbled backward, his face pale as wax. No, this isn't real." But the phantom did not move forward. It stood at the edge of the room, silent and still, eyes calm, reflecting neither hatred nor mercy. The rain framed him in a shimmering veil. When he finally spoke, his voice was not thunder. It was the quiet sound of earth remembering how to breathe. "No more chains," he said. "No more forgetting." Nathaniel's breath hitched. "What do you want from me?" Caleb's voice came like a breeze through the rain. "You don't have to bear it. You just have to see it." And he did. The mansion dissolved around him, walls fading into mist, the floor giving way to the image of fields stretching endlessly beneath the storm. He saw the land as it once was, untouched, alive, breathing. Then he saw the years of toil, the sweat, The cries, the silence. He saw himself among them, not as master, but as part of the same soil. When the vision faded, he wept. Eleanor knelt beside him, holding his trembling hands. "It's over," she whispered. "It has to be." Outside, the storm began to soften. The red rain turned clear. The river's glow dimmed to silver. The world, for the first time in years, felt clean. When they looked up, the phantom was gone. Only the open door remained, rain washing the last of the blood-colored water from the steps. The night breathed deeply, slow, calm, endless. In the silence that followed, the house finally stopped its restless sighing. The whispers faded into the hum of the wind, and as dawn broke, the first light touched the river, turning it to gold. The land, at last, was remembering how to heal. The world woke in silence. After the storm, dawn rose like a whisper, pale, uncertain, almost afraid to show its face. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the land still glistened with the memory of it. A thin veil of mist floated over the fields, soft as smoke, as if the earth itself were exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The mansion stood hollow against the morning light. Its windows were dim eyes, its walls damp and colorless. The grand house that had once loomed like a monument of power now looked small, frail even, as though the storm had washed away not just its paint, but its arrogance. Eleanor opened the door and stepped outside barefoot. The steps were cool beneath her feet, and her nightdress clung to her like a second skin. The world around her was strangely colorless. Even the sky seemed drained. Everything was muted to shades of gray and ivory, as if the world had been reduced to its bones. She walked to the edge of the porch, gazing out at the cotton fields. What she saw made her chest tighten. The fields, once bursting with white, had turned ashen. The blossoms now ghostly gray, their stems brittle from the night's strange rain. The land was still, but it did not feel dead. It felt waiting. Behind her, Nathaniel stepped out slowly. He looked older, not just in body but in soul. The lines on his face seemed carved by time itself. His clothes were still damp, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the wooden pillar beside him. He stared at the horizon where the river wound through the mist. Its waters shimmered faintly, reflecting the washed-out sun. No longer red, no longer white. Just clear, clean and silent, like a mirror emptied of memory. Eleanor spoke first. "It feels like the world forgot its colors." Nathaniel nodded, his voice low. "Maybe it's not forgetting. Maybe it's forgiveness." The two stood together in the silence, listening to the soft rustle of the morning wind. The mansion creaked behind them, settling into its new quiet. No whispers, no footsteps, no echoes of what once haunted its halls. Only peace. Uneasy, fragile peace. Nathaniel looked at the field again, his jaw tight. "Do you think he's gone?" Eleanor turned to him. "No, I think he's part of it now. All of it." He said nothing for a while. His eyes wandered across the horizon toward the barn, the oak tree, the distant river that shimmered faintly under the thin sun. Every corner of the land seemed touched by something unseen. Not destruction, but transformation. The ghosts, it seemed, hadn't left. They had simply become the soil, the air, the silence. Eleanor's hand brushed against his. This house, this land, it was built on sorrow. Maybe last night was the earth's way of tearing that foundation apart. He nodded slowly. "And what happens now?" "We rebuild," she said simply, but not the way it was. A flock of crows broke through the mist, their wings dark against the pale sky. They circled once above the fields, then vanished into the trees beyond the river. The world felt lighter after they passed, as though their flight carried something away, a weight, an unspoken sin. Nathaniel looked down at his hands. "I used to think this land belonged to me," he murmured. "Now I see it never did. It was never anyone's to own." Eleanor looked at him with a quiet kind of pity, not for who he had been, but for who he might still become. "Perhaps that's what he wanted you to understand." They stood there until the sun rose higher, soft gold cutting through the fog. The colors of the world began to return faintly, as if hesitating, green in the distant trees, blue in the river's surface, a flush of warmth on Eleanor's cheeks. The light touched the mansion's face and turned its grey to silver. But the fields, they remained pale. A ghostly white stretched across the horizon. Nathaniel stepped off the porch and walked into the fields, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The plants brushed against his hands like the touch of forgotten souls. He stopped, knelt, and let the soil slip through his fingers. It was cool, soft, and clean. He closed his eyes. For the first time, he didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down. He felt the quiet hum of something reborn. When he returned to the porch, Eleanor was watching him. "You felt it too," she said. He nodded. "Yes, it's different now. It's breathing again." The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of the river in the distance, not a roar, not a whisper, but a song. It was the sound of moving on. Eleanor turned toward the horizon. "Do you think anyone will believe what happened here?" He gave a faint, weary smile. "Maybe they don't need to. Maybe it's enough that the land does." For a moment they both stood in silence, letting the morning sun warm their faces. The house behind them sighed, not a haunted sound, but the gentle exhale of a place finally allowed to rest, and somewhere, far beyond the mist and the cotton and the endless Mississippi sky, the ghost of Caleb drifted like light, not chained to earth, not bound by memory but free. The rain had washed the land clean. The past had been spoken. The morning was ashen, but beneath that ash, something new waited to bloom. The day stretched thin over the land, light falling in soft veils through the trees that bordered the old cotton fields. The world was still trembling from the storm, though no wind stirred now. Every leaf, every stalk, every stone seemed to listen. The air was heavy with the scent of wet soil and ash. A quiet reminder of everything that had burned and everything that refused to die. By noon, Nathaniel and Eleanor had walked to the far edge of the property, where the fields met the river. The Mississippi cut through the earth like a dark ribbon, wide and silent, its surface smooth as glass. The storm had churned its depths, but now it lay calm. Too calm, as though guarding something beneath. Eleanor paused on the muddy bank, clutching the small carved charm she'd found weeks ago, the one that had belonged to Caleb. Its wooden surface was cracked, but warm in her hand, as if it carried a heartbeat of its own. She traced its edges with her thumb, feeling the faint grooves shaped like flowing water. Nathaniel stood beside her, his reflection faint in the river's surface. His face looked different here, stripped of the arrogance that had once shadowed it. The river didn't care who he had been. It mirrored only who he was now, a man standing before the truth of his own land. "Do you hear it?" Eleanor whispered. He frowned, listening. At first there was nothing but the slow lap of water against the shore. Then faintly, a low hum began to rise from beneath the current. It wasn't the wind, it was deeper, older, a sound like the earth itself remembering. Nathaniel's voice was tight. "What is that?" "The river," she said softly. "It's speaking." He stared at her, but she wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the water. The hum grew stronger, and the surface began to ripple, though no wind blew. Shapes began to shimmer just beneath, pale outlines that moved like drifting smoke. They weren't fish. They weren't shadows. They were faces. For a heartbeat, Nathaniel stepped back, his breath catching. Dozens, no hundreds of faint faces moved beneath the water's skin, blurred yet familiar in their sorrow. Men, women, children. Eyes half open, mouths whispering words that could not be heard. Eleanor's hand trembled. "They were never gone," she murmured. "They've always been here." The river's hum deepened into a slow, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat. The water began to glow faintly, not with fire, but with light, pale and unearthly. It illuminated the mud at their feet, revealing shapes buried beneath. Rusted shackles, fragments of cloth, broken tools, bones turned smooth by time. Nathaniel sank to his knees, his eyes wide. The truth spread before him like an unrolled scroll. "This land," he whispered, voice shaking. "This river. It's fed by blood." Eleanor closed her eyes. "By memory. For a long time neither spoke. The air was thick with the weight of revelation, not violent, not wrathful, but sacred. The river was not punishing them. It was showing them. It wanted to be known. Nathaniel reached into the water, his hand breaking the surface. The faces shifted toward him, not in anger, but recognition. The water was cold, yet it pulsed against his skin like breath. A warmth filled his chest, a slow ache of remorse and release. He whispered, "I see you." The current quickened for a moment, then eased, carrying his words downstream. Eleanor stepped forward and placed the small wooden charm into the river. It floated for a few seconds before sinking, slowly, peacefully, into the depths. The glow dimmed, and with it, the faces began to fade, dissolving into the dark. The hum softened until it was only the sound of water again. Nathaniel exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath for a century. "It's over," he said. Though his voice trembled, Eleanor looked at him, her eyes wet. "No, it's begun." He frowned. She pointed to the opposite bank, where new shoots of green had begun to break through the ashen soil. The first signs of life after the storm. The earth, once poisoned by memory, was starting to breathe again. For the first time, Nathaniel understood what it meant to be forgiven, not by people, but by the land itself. Forgiveness wasn't forgetting. It was the quiet act of allowing something new to grow where sorrow once lived. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, they turned back toward the house. Behind them, the river gleamed gold beneath the fading light, its surface rippling with soft reflections of white clouds. The past had not been erased, but it no longer ruled the present. Halfway back, Nathaniel paused and looked over his shoulder one last time. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a figure standing on the far bank, pale against the dark trees, still and silent. Caleb. The figure didn't move or speak. It simply stood there, watching the river, until the mist rose again and swallowed it whole. Nathaniel bowed his head and kept walking. By the time they reached the mansion, twilight had settled in. The walls glowed faintly in the evening's last light. It no longer looked like a house of sorrow. It looked empty, ready to be filled with something else. Eleanor took Nathaniel's hand. "Tomorrow we plant again," she said softly. He nodded. "Yes, but not cotton," she smiled faintly. "No. Something that feeds instead of bleeds." Above them, the first stars broke through the sky, glimmering faintly over the quiet fields. The river whispered behind them, no longer a voice of mourning, but a lullaby. The secret had been spoken, the silence restored. And deep beneath the earth, the field and the river rested together, not haunted, not cursed, but finally understood. Time moved differently after that summer. The river no longer sang in sorrow, but murmured like a cradle song, soft and endless. The fields, once heavy with ghosts, began to grow again. Not cotton this time, but wild grasses, clover, and magnolia vines that crept over the broken fences. Nature reclaimed what men had once chained. Years turned quietly, folding one into another like pages yellowed by age. The Hargrove plantation faded from memory piece by piece, until it was just another story whispered between travelers along the Mississippi Road. A story about light and shadow, about guilt and grace. By the time the 20th century arrived, the house was nothing more than bones of wood and brick, its chimneys leaning like forgotten tombstones. The river, older and wiser, had shifted its path, creeping closer each year until it kissed the foundation of the house itself. And there, where history had once burned in cruelty, the earth had gone still. It was late autumn when Dr. Samuel Weaver came upon it, a historian by trade, a wanderer by heart. His boots sank into the soft mud as he approached the ruins. He had heard the stories from a fisherman in Vicksburg of a phantom field that glowed white under the moon, of a name carved into no stone but remembered in every gust of wind, Caleb. The air was colder here, not unfriendly but alert, as though the land was aware of him. He paused at what was left of the porch. The boards groaned beneath his weight, brittle with age. Through the collapsed doorway, he could see the remains of the grand staircase, half swallowed by vines, its steps leading nowhere. A few pale feathers lay scattered near the entrance, caught in cobwebs and dust. He set down his satchel, drew out a small recorder, and pressed the button. "This is Dr. Samuel Weaver," he said softly. "Hargrove Plantation, or what's left of it. Coordinates, west bank of the Mississippi, 2 miles from the bend. Locals call it the field that breathes." The wind stirred, as if answering him. He stepped carefully toward the open field beyond the house. The ground shimmered faintly beneath the afternoon light, a strange blend of gold and silver. The plants here weren't like the others he'd passed on his journey. They stood taller, more luminous, their leaves pale as parchment. He knelt, running his fingers over a single stalk. The soil was dark and rich but cool to the touch, and then he saw it. One cotton plant, growing alone near the edge of the field. It was impossibly white. So pure it seemed to glow from within. Weaver's breath caught. He'd seen thousands of cotton plants in his research across the South, but never one like this. He plucked a single thread from it, thin and shining like silk. When he rubbed it between his fingers, it left a faint crimson mark on his skin. He froze. The mark wasn't blood, but something older, a stain of memory, of the earth remembering what it had once swallowed. He whispered into his recorder, "The field holds something." The wind sighed through the grass. As the sun dipped lower, the air grew heavy again. The faint hum of insects stilled. The world seemed to pause, waiting. Weaver looked toward the horizon where the river gleamed like molten glass. The current was slow, reflective, serene. But he thought he saw something moving against it, a shape. At first it was just a trick of light, mist swirling in the dusk. But then it solidified, a figure walking along the far bank, pale against the darkening sky. Weaver felt a chill run down his spine. He raised his hand to his brow, squinting through the dim light. The figure stood motionless for a moment, as though gazing across the water at him. There was no menace in its stance, only stillness, the quiet observation of something that had watched for centuries. And then, the voice. It came not from the air, but from around him, from the wind, from the rustling grass, from the whisper of the river as it brushed the bank. Soft, patient, timeless, the field remembers. Weaver stumbled backward, his pulse racing. The words weren't loud, but they filled every space inside him, not heard, but felt. He turned in a slow circle, but the world was empty. The figure was gone. The river glistened peacefully once more. He looked down at his recorder. The red light still blinked. He pressed the playback button, static. Then, faintly, that same whisper again, carried through the white noise. The field remembers. Weaver stood motionless, the wind pressing gently against his coat. The temperature had dropped, but he didn't shiver. He wasn't afraid. Somehow he felt as though he had intruded not on a haunting, but on a memory still alive. He turned off the recorder and slipped it into his pocket. Then, with deliberate calm, he reached into the earth and replanted the cotton thread he had plucked. He pressed it into the soil, covering it with care, his fingers trembling not with fear but reverence. When he rose, the sky had gone violet. The first stars glimmered over the Mississippi, their reflections rippling across the water. Weaver looked back one last time at the ruins, their silhouette framed in the silver light. A faint warmth pulsed through the field. Like breath beneath the soil, he whispered, "Rest, now." The wind seemed to sigh in agreement. Years later, long after Weaver's journal found its way to a university archive, a farmer bought the land. He planted nothing for 3 seasons. The soil refused to take seed. But each spring, without fail, a single white plant would grow near the river, untouched, untended, perfect. Locals say that on moonless nights, if you walk past the old Hargrove land, you can see the mist drift over the fields, glowing faintly like silk. Some claim they hear footsteps in the grass or a quiet hum rising from the ground. But the old folks know better. They say it isn't a haunting. It's remembrance. The land no longer cries. It listens. The The river no longer runs red, it sings. And the spirit that once wandered the fields, Caleb, the phantom who bled his master white, is no longer bound by vengeance or sorrow. He walks now only in silence, a silence that is not empty, but eternal, a silence that holds everything the world tried to forget. And when the wind passes through the ashen fields, brushing over the white that still blooms each spring, it carries a single, sacred truth down the long river of time. The field remembers.